I'm an art and architectural historian, but I've worked as a cultural heritage and consultant and practical preservationist for about 25 years. Sometimes my ideas are not very good, which is why I like to look at what everyone else is doing and steal, or at least learn from, the efforts of others. And that's what I'm going to do today. This talk is about synagogue ruins and a little bit about how they've been dealt with, sometimes demolished, sometimes preserved. This talk is also about types and forms of preservation and commemoration of ruins, missing buildings, including those whose remains have been excavated. Ultimately, however, the effectiveness of the remembrance of architecture is not just about form, but about the kind of activities that will fill the space over time. Today, I will not prescribe any solutions for Vilna or Vilnius, other than that this process of which this conference is beginning continue energetically, but I urge curiosity about other places, openness to different media, and willingness to test small, real steps that people can see and react to now, even while debating bigger plans and dreams. The preservation of ruins has been a debated topic since at least the Renaissance, when antiquarians and architects had to decide which Roman remains to leave and which to pillage for good building materials. In most cases, old buildings like the Septizonian, which you see here, lost, and new ones like St. Peter's won. As I shall discuss further, this same conflict with new practical pressures and added levels of ideology was central to the rebuilding of Europe after the Second World War and continues today. At least since the 16th century, scholars, archaeologists, and architects have also grappled about what to do with underground remains revealed through excavations, such as Nero's Golden House in Rome, which was discovered already in the 15th century. And, by the way, is now again open to the public on a limited basis after being closed for repairs for several years. Similarly, the Catholic Church began excavating Christian catacombs and ruins. This picked up and took on greater meaning during the Catholic Reformation of the late 16th century, when ancient ruins, often revealed beneath later churches, provided real or purported evidence of Christian saints and martyrs. Today, protected outdoor and indoor ruins are found throughout Italy, and sometimes the Italians are very good at providing accessible historical information. Though these efforts were presented as history, meaning the church excavations especially, they were highly selective and a matter of serious church concern. Preservation and presentation of these ruins was primarily for religious and ideological purposes and intended to bolster the Catholic Church's narrative and claim to supremacy in religious matters. While no one thought to exactly rebuild older structures, it was not uncommon for new chapels and memorials to be built on the site of older remains. A not very different selective and ideological approach was taken toward the preservation of historic sites and monuments in the Soviet Union. Already in the interwar period, synagogues in the Soviet Union were systematically transformed into secular culture centers, and this continued after the war in Soviet-controlled countries. In general, the restoration of buildings and monuments, even when dressed in idealistic or altruistic language, remains an expression of a larger agenda about the meaning of the past and the aspirations of the present. Restored buildings can be fully functional, but they are symbols too, and by its very nature, a symbol is charged with meaning. The church had no real interest in preserving the pagan past, or, like later communists, the Jewish one. We should remember that beginning in the 4th century, it was already Christian practice to place new churches over pagan shrines and also synagogues. This was common again in Spain after the expulsion of 1492. It was only with the renegotiation of the Vatican Concordance in the 1980s that the Jewish catacombs in Rome became better known publicly and more easily accessible to non-church-sponsored scholars. Similarly, it was not until the late 1980s that communist regimes here in Lithuania and elsewhere began to show real interest for a variety of reasons in Jewish heritage sites. The cult of ruins grew especially strong in the 18th and 19th centuries. Travelers on the Grand Tour and interest by romantic literati and artists led to academic archaeology, which won the day. As historian Rudy Kosher and others have demonstrated, after the destruction of 20th century warfare, however, ruins were rarely idealized. They were just too many of them to love. And across Europe, each world war led to massive demolition of damaged buildings. And of course, synagogues were especially expendable in the East and the West. Visible ruins left to evoke memory or provoke emotion were replaced with missing buildings, which mostly encouraged forgetfulness and only stimulated longing for the knowledgeable few. Occasionally, fragments of buildings were reused, as in the case of the new Jewish Center in Berlin, built in the 1950s on the site of the Fasanenstrasse synagogue. This brief history relates how ruins of any sort can be understood in the context of Vilnius's Christian and Western history and culture. But it is the millennia-long Jewish tradition of veneration of the ruins of the temple in Jerusalem that is the prime example of the lasting power of ruins in a Jewish context. If Vilna was truly the Jerusalem of Lithuania, then the care of its Jewish ruins should perhaps be likened to the care for the ruins of ancient Jerusalem itself. In order to best remember the vibrant, and some would say inspired history, some fragments need to remain. These would be talismans, literally touchstones of the Jewish past. The great synagogue was not and will never be the temple, but like the ruins of Jerusalem, its presence and its destruction are dramatic reminders of a remarkable era. The total erasure of the great synagogue was in effect an erasure of a much larger history, a forced forgetting. Knowing this history is relevant to understanding of the efforts, or lack of efforts, made to present and protect the ruins of Jewish historic sites in Europe overall, and especially those sites that bear witness to the destruction of the Holocaust. The work has always been difficult, piecemeal, half-hearted, delayed, and often incoherent when it has been carried out at all. Preserving and even marking these sites has never served the interests of those in power. And even when such efforts have been successful, there has always been a mix of altruism and practicality. Discussions of the preservation of historic Jewish space and places are about honoring Holocaust victims, but they are also inevitably about project costs, tourism enhancement, and political impact. Oops, missed that. That's out of order there. Already in the 1920s, the furnishings of the 18th century synagogue of Hornburg, Germany, which was destroyed in 1924, were moved and fitted into the imperfect space of a church to create a local Jewish museum, which is now installed in a less ecclesiastical space of the same monastery complex, constituting the Braunschweig Jewish Museum, part of Braunschweig's Landsmuseum. A more substantial effort to preserve a synagogue ruin took place in Syria, where the 3rd century synagogue of Dura Europos, discovered in 1932 with its remarkable fresco cycle, was rebuilt as a central part of the archaeological museum in French-controlled Damascus, Syria, where it remains today, reportedly still intact during this decade of new destruction. This rebuilding provided the template for the installation of many historic synagogue interiors in museums, first in Germany in the interwar period, and more recently at the Israel Museum. Unfortunately, in Vilna, only a very few elements of the Great Synagogue could be saved, and these are now on view at the Museum of Tolerance, and we'll hear about these later. In the period after World War II, synagogue interiors were moved to Israel, where in 1951 the Italian synagogue of Cornell, Veneto, was installed in a pre-existing building in Jerusalem for continued use as a house of worship. To adapt to the new space, liberties were taken. The Ark and the Women's Gallery were cut down to fit the new or old space, and the bima, which had been against a short wall, was placed in the center. At the Israel Museum, not all of the imported synagogue interiors fully fit the spaces in which they have been recreated, so liberties have been taken there too. The synagogue of Vittorio Veneto has been perfectly installed, but the dimensions of the Tzedek Vashalom synagogue from Paramaribo, Suriname, have been changed, and only the furnishings were brought to Israel. In Warsaw's new Poland Museum, the painted ceiling that is one of the most celebrated installations is an approximate replica of the destroyed Gwójek synagogue, not made at full scale. Because its gallery placement is entirely contemporary, there is no implication that either the ceiling or the room belonged to the actual worship space once frequented by Gwójek Jews. The installation is an evocation or an echo of what is lost, not the real thing. It is a symbol of the wooden synagogues, not the real thing. And I should add that just recently, the rebuilt synagogue in Volpa has been created in a historic village of old buildings in Bilgeraj, Poland. This is entirely a replica set in a faux historic setting, but meant to evoke a lost era and a lost architecture, and seems a perfectly reasonable exercise in recreation. In all these cases, the essential part of the synagogue has been seen to be the interior. The exterior shells have been left behind. In the best cases, as with the Vittorio Veneto synagogue, the old interiors have been completely inserted into their new setting in the same way that many period rooms have been recreated in major art museums in the world. Many former synagogues where the wall still stood have also been renovated to approximate their pre-war appearance, and sometimes to expertly replicate it. This has been accelerated in the 1990s, and the work is well known to any Jewish traveler and has been the subject of many conferences and publications. It continues in many countries today, including Lithuania, and in recent years, since the publication of the impressive study, The Synagogues of Lithuania, there has been a dramatic increase in attempts to restore still extant former synagogue buildings for new appropriate use. And we can see this at Joniškis, Kėdainiai, and now at Pakruojis and Zizmarai and Alytus. And pardon my pronunciation of the Lithuanian names. Since World War II, it has been recognized that not all standing ruins can be and should be rebuilt, but it has been accepted that some ruins can be preserved as ruins. Thus, in England, the ruins of Coventry Cathedral were preserved, and in Berlin, the ruins of the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church were also left. And in Dresden, the ruins of the Frauenkirche were venerated as testament to the destruction of the Allied bombing of the city. In 1966, these ruins were officially declared by the former GDR a memorial against war. Ironically and dramatically, soon after German reunification, a popular movement began to rebuild the Frauenkirche, and this took on international momentum. Eventually, 180 million euro was raised to rebuild the church, which reopened in 2005. The project's success prompted interest in rebuilding other iconic destroyed buildings in other cities. And in a certain sense, the initial urge to better recognize the Vilna Great synagogue site, articulated in the late 1980s and early 1990s, is part of this movement. As we have already seen, the facsimile of the Palace of the Grand Dukes of Lithuania here in Vilnius, which was demolished in 1801 and reopened in a new form in 2009, is evidence of contemporary abilities to resurrect dead buildings from nothing. In 1989, I began on work on synagogue restoration projects, and there were only a few examples of synagogue ruins left deliberately intact and treated as a monument. Some of these were excavated ancient sites like Sardis and Ostia. Others were remote ruins like the 17th century synagogue at Joden in Suriname. Of synagogues destroyed in the Holocaust, only remains in Tarnów, which you saw in Sergei Kravtsov's talk yesterday, Poland, were established as a memorial park. And beginning in 1988, the site of the Choral Synagogue in Riga, Latvia became a monument, but it was in a bad neighborhood, and until 2007, it was mostly neglected. Surprisingly, even today, there is little interest in saving former synagogues as ruins, though hundreds of derelict and empty synagogues remained in Europe. But immediately after the war, many synagogues were repurposed as barns, warehouses, garages, factories, shops, cinemas, houses, and other uses. Since the 1990s, more and more of these buildings have been restored as historic monuments, cultural centers, and whenever possible, as functional centers for Jewish activity, prayer, study, or culture. Until recently, there has been no vocal constituency for ruins as memorials. Fully abandoned buildings were often too deteriorated for reuse, or in places where no Jews survived to demand commemoration, even if this were allowed under communism. So only a few, such as Tarnów, and now since 2012 in Jaworzyce, Poland, have been deliberately treated as preserved ruins, as if they were vestiges of ancient Greece or Rome. While for many this is a least good solution, I think it is often the most honest one, and one that doesn't try to rewrite the history of death and destruction, but accepts it and uses the ruin as an artifact for remembrance and education. Destruction is part of the history of the site. In some sense, this takes us back to an attitude prevalent after the First World War, where it was believed that some ruins of wartime should be left as powerful reminders of the destructive force of intolerance. One of the first and unexpected interventions to recover Jewish ruins was in Worms, Germany, in the 1950s, where the medieval synagogue was rebuilt with some strong interest locally and by Worms' Jewish exiles. The Worms synagogue had been demolished almost to its foundations and was rebuilt to replicate as much as possible the pre-war appearance. The result, of course, is something new, but like the old city of Warsaw, which was being rebuilt at about the same time, in the half-century since the rebuilding, even these facsimiles have taken on the patina of age and are now revered as surviving relics. The experience for the visitor is very different when viewing the archaeological remains of the synagogue of Speyer, Germany, nearly contemporary with Worms. This synagogue was not in use after the 16th century, so its destruction was not the result of the Holocaust. Thus, there was never thought of rebuilding except in digital form. Here, the archaeological remains of the synagogue and the entrance to the intact mikveh are at ground level and have been consolidated, protected, and are presented in a more traditional manner, but partially enclosed with a beautifully simple museum complex that could be an inspiration for the great synagogue site here. In cities where Jews were murdered or expelled in the Middle Ages, as in Cologne, Germany, Vienna, Austria, and Regensburg, also in Germany, synagogues were often torn down. Public memory of these places has only been recovered in recent decades. But although these synagogues were demolished centuries before the Holocaust and the final demolition, for instance, of the Vilnius synagogue, they do have bearing on the situation here. The remains of these totally lost medieval buildings have been excavated in recent decades, and each locality, along with the rebuilding of the synagogue of Worms in the 1950s, demonstrates a different solution for post-destruction and post-excavation treatment. In Vienna, excavation of the medieval synagogue at the Judenplatz became tied to the discussion of the creation of the Holocaust Memorial in the city. Recognition of the violent murder of Jews and the destruction of the synagogue in the 15th century seemed inextricably linked to the popularity of Nazism and anti-Semitism in Austria in the 20th century. The remains of the synagogue and the Jewish quarter were well below present-day ground level, and after the excavation, some of these were left in situ, and an underground museum and learning center was established as a branch of the local Jewish museum. These were modest remains with a big story to tell. They are not visible from the street, but they are there for those who make the effort. Up above, the large Holocaust memorial, designed by Rachel Whitehead, dominates the area. In Regensburg, Germany, the medieval synagogue was torn down in 1519 when Jews were expelled from the town, and it was replaced by a church. The synagogue is well known from two illustrations by Alfred Altdorfer, who was also on the committee that advocated the expulsion and demolition. And it was long thought that the church was built over the synagogue, but in fact, in the 1990s, it was discovered that the remains were intact at the Neuferplatz, which was an open space next to the church. Careful excavations were carried out, and the final decision was not to expose the ruins in perpetuity, but rather to cover them and replace them with a monument. This is the sculpture Mizrach that was designed by the Israeli sculptor Danny Caravan and dedicated in 2005. You can see that this monument is a very active one. It's the center of a lively square in the city where people come and go. It is a memorial in a sense, but it is a happy place, and probably because of the separation from specific Holocaust memory, it allows it to be seen more as a historic remembrance and therefore as a public amenity as much as a memorial. But it can serve Jewish purposes, as you can see here, where it is the scene of annual Kristallnacht commemorations in Regensburg. In Cologne, the medieval synagogue was first excavated after World War II, and that was revealed in post-bombing rubble of the city, and we're going to hear a lot more about that in another presentation shortly, so I will not dwell on that, but the solution there is a special one. In addition to these totally destroyed medieval buildings, there's also been the recovery of several medieval synagogues that were subsequently transformed for other purposes, and in these cases, older remains have been literally excavated out of the later building fabric. And the list of these synagogues is growing, but it includes former synagogues in Sopron, Hungary, in Maribor, Slovakia, and in Erfurt, Germany. Just some water. My timer says I have 6 minutes, John. Okay, in this decade, at least 2 other sites of synagogues destroyed in the Holocaust have been marked with well-designed art and urban interventions, similar in approach, though different in style, to what was done in Regensburg. In Lviv, Ukraine, states municipal-sponsored competition created what is known as the space of synagogues. This abuts the site of the Golden Rose Synagogue, which is preserved with 3 walls and a sunken interior. And someday this could still be rebuilt. It would be a relatively small project compared to the Frauenkirche, for instance, in Dresden. Next to this was the site of a large Bet Midrash, synagogue, study house, and this was totally destroyed. It has not been excavated, but its plan is indicated, inscribed, if you will, on a new landscape plaza. And between these 2 spaces are a series of slabs which recall matzevot, Jewish tombstones, but instead of traditional funerary inscriptions, there is historical information, including quotes from distinguished people and rabbis and other relevant texts. I'm sorry, I keep going the wrong way. My eyes are not good enough for this. There, you see that. In Germany, destroyed synagogues, hundreds of which were destroyed on Kristallnacht in November 1938, were frequently marked with plaques and sometimes with more significant monuments. And this is the case in Osnabrück here, a monument that was put up in the 1970s. But more recently, the synagogue in Marburg, Germany, has been dramatically marked with what is called a remembrance garden, a garden of remembrance, which opened in 2012. This is a transitional site. It takes a scarred landscape and makes it a public amenity, but it also includes many devices for evoking memory, but also for stimulating communal conversation. And foremost of these elements are a series of 10 glass boxes that are set in the landscaped area, and these boxes contain notes. The notes are changed annually, and they are not predicted. These are not curated text of specific historical events or descriptions. They are reactions or contemplations by citizens groups who have been convened to discuss the Jewish history and the history of the site and to react to it and then to contribute these words. So every year there's a changing reflection of the community on the meaning of this place. The first year, 2012, used texts that were gleaned from interviews of survivors, people who had been exiled from Marburg and who were now living in Israel. But more recently, local groups from Marburg itself, non-Jews, have actively participated. And then, very dramatically on the site, rather than reconstructing the whole building, you see it inscribed, its plan inscribed in the garden, but to realize what it looked like, there is this bronze monument. I want to end with 2 examples from the United States. This is from my own hometown of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where I grew up, and I know both of these sites well. This is the site of Franklin's Court in Philadelphia, which was excavated in the late 1950s and 60s when the city was being transformed, trying to recreate its colonial past. Franklin's buildings, the houses of Benjamin Franklin, were long gone, but it was decided, based on descriptions in his letters, to recreate them with these frames designed by the architect Robert Venturi, and to evoke the space, the volumes. And then underneath, on the pavement, just like in Lviv, more recently, are inscribed text. And these texts are literal passages from Ben Franklin's letters to his wife, where he talks about what needs to be added or built on the house. And this model has been followed now in many other places, so it's not so dramatic and unique. This is an example from a church that was reborn in Virginia. And you can see this is a symbolic representation rather than the complete restoration or replication of the building like the synagogue from Volpa that's been built in Bilgerai, or even the palace here in Lviv. And then lastly, there is this site which opened just a few years ago in Philadelphia, just a few steps from Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell. This is Independence Hall, and that's the Liberty Bell. This is the house where George Washington lived when he was president in the first days of the new republic. And it was excavated recently, and the story that is told is not only that of George Washington, but of all the slaves that he brought from Virginia to serve him in otherwise free Pennsylvania. And the archaeological evidence provided some guidance, but essentially other sources allowed a deconstruction of domestic forms to create a new sculptural memorial which evoked 18th century grand domesticity, but it was used more as a scaffolding, a billboard to present information about the white elite, but also the lives of the slaves who lived in the house too. And remarkably, many of them who were able to escape to freedom right under George Washington's nose and live long and prosperous lives in Pennsylvania in the decades to come. So thanks for your attention. This just touches on the subject of restoration and preservation of ruins. One could have do a seminar all year just on this topic, and we have many talented people who've worked in the field. We're going to learn more in the coming presentations about efforts in Berlin and Cologne and here in Lithuania. So thank you for your attention, and we all work hard for this project in the years to come.